All right, so here we are going to sew our binding strips together. Again, we're going to put them right sides together and then at a right angle to each other. And we're going to sew from the top upper left corner to lower right corner. You can switch your foot out to your regular sewing foot. It'll make it a little easier, but I'm going to go ahead and use the walking foot because I'm not going to change them. All right, so now that that is sewn, you clip your threads and you cut this, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this is the sewing line. I'm cutting a 1/4 inch away. All right, now I have one continuous seam strip for my binding. You want to use a diagonal seam like this when you do binding, because if you do a straight seam, the next step is to fold this in half and you'll have this big bulky bulge here, where if you see here when I fold it in half, half the seam is here, half the seam is there. It's proportionally just positioned inside and it won't cause a bulge on your binding. So the next step is to press this and then to press this down. And so I'm going to go do that and then I'll come back and we'll bind this piece. So here's our binding all pressed and ready to go. And this is where the seam is. So this is the shorter end of it. I'm going to start with the shorter end so this seam does not end up at the bottom where I'm going to have to sew the two pieces together. So to do a binding on this, I am going to start on the bottom and I'm going to start sewing way over here. I'm going to sew up and around and across the top and back down so that in the end I have the two tails at the bottom to join for the binding. So I will show you that step here in just a second. Let's go ahead and sew this on. And you always want to leave like a 6 to 8 inch tail so that you have enough to get it under the machine to sew them back together. So let's go ahead and bind this. Oh, and I'm sorry, we're going to sew on the wrong side first and then bring it to the front because I'm going to machine sew it down. If you're going to hand sew it, you would sew it onto the front and pull it to the back and hand sew it down. But I'm going to do it by machine, and so you'll see what that looks like. All right. So using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a walking foot, I'm just going to go ahead and sew this. You stop a 1/4 inch from the edge and do a reverse. And you do a French fold in the corner, which means I'm taking the binding, let's get it all up here, and I'm going to fold it up like this. So I create a 45-degree angle, okay? And then I keep my thumb here and I bring the binding down and make sure that that fold is aligned with the raw edge. That is a French fold. And the straighter this is, the better your corner will be. So now that we have that in place, we're going to start right on the end. I'm going to remove this, but I'm holding the ribbon with pressure. So we're catching that ribbon. And I'm going to come up here. And as I get closer, we'll take this one out. Now there's that angled piece. All I'm going to do is angle it gently. I'm not going to do a fold or anything at that point. And you're going to have a pucker there, and that's okay. We will catch it on the other side. All right. Now when we get up to the corner, we're going to do another fold, stopping a 1/4 inch from the end, reverse. Get rid of your threads. Now we're going to do another French fold, but this is not a 90 degrees, so it's not going to be, it's going to be more like a 60 degree. See what that looks like? Okay. stop at the 1/4 inch, reverse. Okay, now we're going to do our last French fold. And we're really not going to sew very far. I just need to anchor this guy down. Okay, and that's as far as we're going to stitch right now because we need to sew these two ends together. So the first thing we're going to do is you can see that this tail is way longer than this. So I'm just going to trim it to get rid of it. We don't need all that. It's like it's not enough for one strip, but just too much. You need to have a 1.5 or 1 1/4, I guess. All right, so now we need to put these two tails together to finish our binding. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use a little cutting mat, a 28mm rotary cutter, and this is our binding ruler. This is the 2.5 inch, and we also make one for 2 1/4 inch. All the math is in the ruler, so you do need the right ruler for the size binding you're using. There are a couple videos on our YouTube channel, I'll link them below, on how to use the binding rulers, but I'm going to walk through it here as well. Alright, so the first thing you need to do is we're going to have the seam about here. So this is also too long. I'm just going to get rid of some of that. So the first thing we do is we open up at the bottom tail, lay it on my mat. The ruler says readable side always up. So we're going to put the ruler on the binding, aligning the top and the side and the bottom. And we're going to go ahead and cut this angle. This is a 45-degree angle. And I obviously need a new blade. Then to do the top half, we open up the top. And this is much easier on a bigger quilt, believe it or not. Smaller is harder. So, and then we lay this bottom tail that we already cut into the top tail. And we're going to put a straight pin in the top tail where that bottom tail meets it. Okay, so there's the bottom tail. It's meeting the top tail, and we just put a pin there. Then we flip this guy open. And we are going to back this up a little, so I have some room to work. Alright. Now we have our straight pin, and our ruler has a groove cut in the ruler. The groove locks right over that pin, so that it doesn't slide anywhere. That's what makes our binding ruler the best. You can align the top edge of the ruler with the binding, the bottom with the binding, and then we're going to cut, make sure I have some room here. I'm going to cut this, okay? The math is between here and here, so we need to cut that first, then you pull the pin out, and then you can go ahead and cut your second angle. Okay, now we're done with all of that. Alright, so sew the two ends together. We open up the bottom tail, open up the top tail. You just align the two pieces and just sew them together. Now we have our nice 1/4 inch seam, and look at that. It just lays down flat. You can take it over to the iron and press it, but I just find finger pressing it, that seam down, it helps. And that's just because I was trying to use the walking foot and it slipped on me. It'll be fine. It's on the inside of my binding. All right, now we're going to keep those clipped in the middle, and now we're going to bring this binding around to the front. And now we need to stitch it down on the front to finish it, and then we will be all done with our pencil cup. All right, so we are ready to tack down our binding on the finished edge. And how I do it is I use invisible thread. I use Aurifil invisible thread. I use it in my bobbin and in my top thread. And I don't have any issues. The Aurifil is my favorite. YLI is my second favorite. So you can find either of those is great. And then I'm going to use a blind hem stitch. And I will show you that after I finish this. I'll flip over to the stitches. But a blind hem stitch goes like this: straight V, straight V. The straight is going into here, the V is going to go into my binding. So if you don't want to use invisible thread, you want to use a thread that matches your binding, not your piece, because that's where the thread is going to show the most. I usually will start on a nice straight area. I turn the stitch width and stitch length both down to 1.25. So it's a nice small stitch that disappears. And we're going to start here. We'll work to the corner. We're going to fold the corner up. It'll catch the ribbons. And then once we're all done, the whole piece is done. So let's get started. Oh, and if you have a needle position, put it to the center. That makes it a little easier. All right, so we're going to start sewing that over. Then when we get to the corner, we're going to create a 45-degree angle here, a nice clean angle. And then I'm going to turn, stitch down the angle, and then reverse stitch back up. I am not breaking the thread. And then I'm going to do the same here. Make sure you don't stitch your pocket edge down. And as you're pulling it around to the front, you want to make sure that you're looking at it and you're pulling it evenly, so you don't just like pull it too far and get it to buckle. So just a gentle, it should have your fabric in the binding, but you shouldn't have a lot of space there. And then when we come up to the angle, we're just going to have a little bit there, and we're just going to ease it in. There we go. And then when we get up here again, it's a funky angle, so it's not going to be a 45. So you just sort of roll it with your finger till it looks nice. Then go back out, go back in. And that's actually how I bind all my quilts as well, from the back, and then use the blind hem stitch for the front. So that's all bound. So let me show you the stitch we were talking about. So on my machine, it's that one. That's what it looks like. It's stitch number 3 on my machine, but this is a blind hem stitch. Most machines have that stitch, so you can just look for the stitch. And then over here you'll see my stitch length is at 1 1/4. My stitch width is at 1 1/4. I have my needle down, and there's the stitch showing up. So that is how you do a blind hem stitch with invisible thread, or like I said, if you want to match your piece, just match to the binding, not to the background. So let's get a close-up here so you can see what it looks like. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, make sure you like and subscribe below. You can find the Whimsical Workshop on our website, thewhimsicalworkshop.com, and that has all links to all of our other social media platforms. Thanks for joining us.